If you've ever sat alone in a room filled with other people's memories, wondering how you became invisible in your own story, you might recognize the quiet ache I carried the morning I buried my daughter. My name is Elena Porter. I used to believe that family meant protection, a circle you could lean against when the wind picked up. But some winds knock everything down, and when the dust settles, you realize you were standing alone all along. 3 weeks ago, I lost my only child, Mira. She was 8 years old and thought the moon was close enough to touch if she just reached a little higher. She liked drawing rocket ships on the kitchen walls and covered every disappointment with a blizzard of stickers and crayon stars. There are things you imagine you'll have time to say someday. Little promises, gentle goodbyes. But someday has a habit of never coming. On the morning of her funeral, I sat in my car, hands trembling, staring at a single text from my mother. Okay, not I'm sorry, not I'm here. Just that, okay. Grief is never just about loss. It's about the empty spaces where comfort should have been. I'd always pictured family as a row of strong shoulders people who would show up when you needed them most, who would stand beside you, even if words failed. But as I walked into the hushed light of the funeral home, I saw those first rows, the ones reserved for family, empty as unclaimed pews in a forgotten church. The photos of Mira, her crooked smile at Halloween, the star-shaped Band-Aid on her knee, her last birthday candle stood like silent witnesses to the life we'd shared. But not a single person I'd grown up calling family came to say goodbye. Maybe you think stories like this always turn tragic. Maybe you expect anger or spiral into despair. But I've learned that sometimes heartbreak isn't the end. Sometimes it's the point where you stop shrinking and start becoming someone new. This isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about what happens next when the people you trust most choose absence over love and you realize you have nothing left to lose except your own silence. In the next hour, I want to invite you to walk with me through every quiet moment, every sharp realization, and every small stubborn step back toward wholeness. Maybe you've stood where I stood on the edge of something precious, wondering if you mattered at all. Or maybe you just need to know that even the deepest betrayals can plant the seeds of your greatest strength. This is the story of how I buried my daughter, said goodbye to the family I thought I had, and found a life worth living in the ruins they left behind. And I promise you sometimes, the ending you never wanted is the beginning you most need. The day of Mira's funeral, the world outside seemed determined to carry on as if nothing had changed. I remember how strange that felt, how birds still sang, how neighbors still watered their lawns, how somewhere someone was laughing at a joke I would never hear. It's a strange thing to realize that your worst day is just another Thursday to everyone else. Maybe that's why. When I first saw the picture, Brielle posted a glossy photo of my sister beaming in front of her new house champagne flute. Raised, I felt something colder than grief settle inside me. They'd chosen that day out of all days to celebrate a housewarming. Not just any house, but the one Mira loved most, my grandmother's old cottage with the pink tile kitchen and the creaky stairs that sounded like giggles if you stepped just right. It felt surreal scrolling through photos of laughter and celebration while I sat in a pew, surrounded by silence. There was my mother arm linked with Brielle's, her eyes shining in the same kitchen where Mira once drew constellations on the window with a foggy fingertip. The caption read, "New beginnings. The family first." For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the last year, if maybe there had been a mistake and Mira would burst through the door covered in glitter and apologies. But reality has a way of landing hard, and I knew deep down that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. My family had weighed the importance of my daughter's goodbye against the convenience of Brielle's party and decided some things could wait, but not their celebration. I tried to find comfort in logic, telling myself there must have been a scheduling conflict or a reason too urgent to ignore. But when I called, the truth was delivered with a tone I recognized from years of gentle dismissal. "You know how much this means to Brielle?" My mother said, her voice crisp as if discussing a dinner reservation instead of a funeral. "We've planned this for weeks. It's her first home." "Don't be dramatic, Elena. You knew this was coming." I realized then that the pain I felt wasn't from their absence alone, but from the way my grief was treated as an inconvenience. Something to be shuffled around on a family calendar, not a tragedy that should pause the world. As the party unfolded a few miles away, I sat on Mira's old swing in our backyard, letting the wind twist me gently back and forth. I remembered Mira's laughter, how she'd drag Brielle out to the garden to look for shooting stars, how she'd insist that every house we passed on our walks belonged to someone with a story. That little house, the one filled with Brielle's party guests, was the place Mira always said should stay in our family forever. She had a child's way of believing that love alone could keep bricks together. Watching the sunlight flicker through the leaves, I realized that some houses become haunted not by ghosts, but by the memories of those who never returned. Looking back, I see now how patterns can be set long before we notice them. My sister was always the sun around which our family orbited. Brielle was the golden child, charming, quick-witted, always deserving of one more chance. I was the reliable one, the helper, the one who remembered birthdays and did the dishes at Thanksgiving, while everyone else swapped stories in the living room. My mother called it being practical. I called it invisible. It's easy to excuse favoritism when it hides behind family jokes and gentle ribbing, but standing alone on the day you need someone most makes every old wound sting anew. I've heard people say that tragedy brings families together, that old feuds melt away in the face of real loss. I used to believe that too. I thought my mother and sister would appear at my door, eyes wet with apology, arms ready to hold what words could not repair. But sometimes loss doesn't unite, it reveals. Sometimes the spaces we expect people to fill are left empty, and in those gaps, we finally see the shape of our relationships for what they are. I learned that day that some people confuse family with familiar. Just because someone shares your history doesn't mean they will carry your heartbreak. It took time to accept that I wasn't just mourning Mira. I was grieving the idea of family I'd held close for so long. There's a sharpness in that kind of realization, a cold clarity that leaves you standing in the ruins of old expectations. But there is also freedom. In the quiet of my empty house, I allowed myself to feel the full ache, not just of Mira's absence, but of every small dismissal, every missed call, every okay that stood in for real love. I thought of Mira's hope that a house could keep people together and realized that sometimes the walls that matter most are the ones we build inside ourselves. The lesson, if there is one, is that grief will introduce you to yourself. It will take away the easy answers and force you to see what's real. On the day my family chose a party over my pain, I stopped asking for their approval. I stopped hoping for the apology that would make everything make sense. Sometimes the only way forward is to honor your own story even when no one else is there to witness it. I promised myself that day, sitting beneath the swing's slow arc, that I would not let anyone else decide the value of my sorrow. And so as the sun set behind Brielle's new house, once my grandmother's, once Mira's favorite, I began the long, slow work of letting go. Not just of Mira, but of the illusion that love is owed, that loyalty can be demanded, that family means belonging by default. I didn't know it yet, but this was the first small step toward reclaiming something precious, the right to my own story, unedited and unapproved by anyone but me. That night, as silence filled every corner of my home, I picked up the phone not to call my mother or sister, but to reach out to someone who might help me understand what came next. It was time to ask different questions to seek different answers. And in that simple act, I felt the faintest flicker of strength return. Tomorrow I would discover a truth that would change everything. For now, I let myself rest in the quiet gathering, what little hope I had left for the battles ahead. The next morning, the world felt heavier, as if the weight of what had happened the day before pressed against every surface of my home. I wandered from room to room, touching the things Mira had loved, the frayed corner of her favorite blanket, a row of action figures lined up on the windowsill, a half-finished drawing still taped to the fridge. In those quiet hours, I felt the kind of silence that settles over a house, not simply as the absence of sound, but as the presence of something unspoken. It's the hush that follows disappointment, the stillness that remains when words are too brittle to carry what needs to be said. Grief changes your understanding of silence. At the funeral, the hush had been so thick, I could almost feel it moving through the room. The seats in the front row reserved for family stayed empty, an echo of every promise never kept. The funeral director, a man with gentle hands and tired eyes, greeted me with a nod meant for 2, then 3, then more. I remember how his gaze flicked toward the doorway each time it opened, hopeful for the late arrival of someone who belonged to me. No one came. Every chair in the front, every space set aside for kin bore silent testimony to what had gone missing from my life. After the service, friends and neighbors hugged me tightly. They spoke in low voices, offering food help with errands, a willingness to sit in silence, if that was all I needed. Their kindness was a balm, but their presence also threw my family's absence into sharper relief. I thought back to holidays and birthdays, when I had been the one arranging chairs, setting out plates, making sure there was room for everyone. It hurt to realize that when the roles were reversed, When I was the one in need of comfort, there was no one to arrange a chair for me. Sometimes you learn who your people are not in moments of celebration, but in moments of deepest vulnerability. That evening, as dusk slipped quietly through the windows, I sat at Mira's old desk. I ran my fingers over the constellation of paint stains she'd left behind, little flecks of color from afternoons spent making art for her nurses. Each piece told a story, a swirling purple nebula, for the radiologist who let her watch cartoons, a clumsy spaceship, for the technician with the peppermint-scented gloves. The nurses had once told me Mira brings the sunshine with her, even on the hard days. Now with her gone, the light felt dimmer, but her spirit lingered in every stroke of crayon and every strip of glitter tape. It's easy in the middle of grief to imagine you are the only one who's ever felt so alone. But as I scrolled through the messages that trickled in notes from teachers, from neighbors, from the hospital staff, I realized I wasn't truly alone. These were people who had shown up for Mira for me even when it wasn't convenient. They sent photos from the service memories of Mira's jokes, recipes for the banana pancakes she'd loved. Their words didn't erase the ache, but they offered a small, steady comfort, a reminder that love, real love, doesn't need to be asked for. It simply arrives and stays. One of the hardest lessons I learned in those early days was that pain doesn't always bring people closer. I had expected that loss would bridge the gaps in my family, but the opposite was true. My mother's silence. Brielle's absence weren't simply forgetfulness, they were decisions. Choices made long before Mira got sick, patterns repeated through birthdays, missed calls, unanswered gestures of care withheld. It's a mistake many of us make, believing that tragedy will heal old wounds or change the shape of relationships that have always been lopsided. I came to understand that the silence from my family was not a void waiting to be filled, but a wall I had spent years pretending wasn't there. Sometimes, in order to move forward, you have to see things as they really are, not as you wish they would be. I stopped making excuses for my mother, stopped telling myself that Brielle was just busy. Grief, for all its pain, is also clarifying. It strips away pretense, leaving only the raw truth behind. My truth was this: I mattered, even if my family could not or would not see it. I remember that lesson most sharply one night, a few days after the funeral. I was sorting through a box of Mira's drawings to mail to her favorite nurse when a card slipped from the pile. It was a thank you note written in Mira's careful looping script, addressed simply, "To Mom for being my favorite star." Tears slid down my cheeks, not for what I had lost, but for the love I had always had right in front of me. In that moment, I realized something powerful sometimes. The deepest connections are the ones you build yourself through, showing up, through staying kind, through honoring your truth even when others won't. And so, as the first days of mourning gave way to weeks, I let the silence become a canvas instead of a cage. I filled it with memories of Mira, with the kindness of friends, with new routines that honored both my love and my loss. I gave myself permission to stop waiting for the apology that would never come, the call that would not arrive. There was a strange kind of peace in that acceptance, a freedom to begin gently, to heal. Little did I know those quiet days were leading me toward a discovery that would shift the ground beneath my feet. It was a truth buried not in memory, but in paperwork, in legal lines, and long-forgotten promises. The call I would make next to an old family lawyer would reveal secrets that changed everything I thought I knew about the people I'd been mourning. The silence, it turned out, was not empty after all. It was full of answers waiting to be found. The days that followed felt both achingly slow and strangely urgent. There's a peculiar energy that comes after the deepest sorrow, a kind of restless searching, as if your heart, not knowing where to go, tries every door, just to see if any will open. One morning in the gray hush before sunrise, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of cold tea bills spread out like puzzle pieces. Among the stacks was a folder I'd barely noticed before, documents from when my grandmother died, mixed in with insurance statements and sympathy cards. Something about the sight of her familiar handwriting made me pause. My grandmother had always been the anchor in our family, steadfast, practical, the kind of woman who kept emergency money in a coffee tin and a list of birthdays taped inside the cupboard door. Her house, the small pink-tiled cottage at the heart of so many childhood memories, was more than bricks and mortar. It was the setting for every important moment. First steps, last Christmases, Mira's first attempt at baking cookies. After Grandma's funeral, my mother and Brielle had both insisted the house should stay in the family. At the time, exhausted by hospital visits and fear, I'd agreed, letting Brielle move in with the promise that the paperwork would be handled when things settled down. But that paperwork deed transfers legal forms had never been finished. As I flipped through the folder, I found a letter addressed to me tucked between property tax receipts. In her neat sloping script, Grandma wrote, "This house belongs to you, Elena. Give it away only when you're truly ready." Reading those words, I felt a jolt of something fierce and unexpected, a mix of ownership, responsibility, and grief. Had I ever been ready, or had I, in the fog of Mira's illness, simply handed away what I thought I couldn't handle? I picked up the phone and dialed James Reeve, our family's old attorney. His voice, though older and rougher around the edges than I remembered, was gentle as he listened to my story. "Let's check the deed together," he offered, and within an hour we were sitting across from each other in his book-lined office documents spread between us. With practiced care, he traced the paperwork page by page. "Elena," he finally said, "the house is still legally yours. Your name is on the deed. Brielle has no ownership at all." The words landed like a pebble dropped into deep water, sending ripples of shock relief and a slow-burning anger through me. It's strange how a legal technicality can change the way you see everything. Suddenly, the feeling of powerlessness I'd carried for months was replaced by a new certainty. I hadn't truly given away the house, I'd given away the keys, not the foundation. Brielle and my mother had counted on my exhaustion, on my instinct to say yes, to do what was easiest for others. They'd relied on old patterns. Elena will handle it. Elena will let it go. But sometimes what you let go of comes back not to haunt, but to heal. Sitting in James's office, I thought back to every moment my family had manipulated me with guilt and urgency. I remembered the afternoon just after Mira's diagnosis, when my mother had twisted her wedding ring and said Brielle needs a fresh start. "You already have so much, Elena." It's a tactic I think many families use, pressuring the strong one, the steady one, to carry more. In the moment weighed down by grief and exhaustion, I'd nodded along, believing I was doing what was right. But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, especially when they aren't protected by boundaries. That day I learned the quiet but crucial difference between kindness and self-sacrifice. Kindness is a gift you choose. Self-sacrifice given endlessly without protection can become a kind of slow erasure. For years, I'd mistaken my willingness to give for a requirement to surrender everything. It took a legal deed and a tired lawyer's gentle explanation to show me that there were lines I was allowed no required to draw. James printed a new copy of the deed and handed it to me with a reassuring smile. "You're the owner, Elena. It's your call what happens next." Holding the document, I felt the weight of my grandmother's intentions, the hopes she'd folded into her bequest. This house wasn't just a place, it was a promise one I could finally decide how to keep or break. As I left James's office, the sky outside was clearing sunlight filtering through the morning haze. In my purse, the deed felt heavier than I expected, a small, crisp proof that my story for once wasn't being written by someone else. I understood in a way I never had before that love without boundaries can become a tool for others to shape your life in their image. Protecting what's yours isn't selfish. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for those who truly depend on you. Returning home, I placed the deed beside Mira's last drawing on my desk, two artifacts from very different chapters of my life. The next step wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be anger, denial, and perhaps even more silence. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what reclaiming my own ground might cost. I was ready to face whatever storm would come because I knew finally that some foundations are worth defending. What I didn't realize then was that this discovery about the house was only the beginning. Sometimes when you start asking questions, the answers come tumbling out faster than you expect. Sometimes they reveal truths that were hiding in plain sight all along. As I prepared to confront my mother and sister, I stumbled across something else in that folder, years' worth of bank statements, each holding its own quiet confession. What I would find next would turn my world upside down once again and force me to question not just what I'd lost, but what had been taken from me all along. I thought I knew the extent of my pain. I thought grief had shown me everything it could, had emptied every pocket of my life and left nothing unturned. But as I sat down at my desk that evening, the folder from my grandmother open beside me, I realized there was more to uncover, layers beneath the loss that demanded their own reckoning. Stacked behind the deed and my grandmother's careful letters were years of bank statements, tax records, and notes I barely remembered asking to keep. Their presence felt almost accidental, the kind of detail you only notice when you're finally ready to look. I started reading in the quiet, the numbers swimming at first, then resolving into patterns too sharp to ignore. Each month for almost 5 years, there was a transfer $2,000, always on the first leaving my account and landing in my mother's. At first, I thought it must be a mistake, some automatic bill or a loan I'd forgotten. But the pattern was relentless during the months when Mira was sickest, when every cent went to medication and care. The money still left my account silent and unquestioned. The realization sat like ice in my chest. In the hardest times of my life, when I was scraping by selling first editions and skipping meals to pay for treatment, the person who should have helped was quietly siphoning what I couldn't afford to lose. I found other papers, car loan documents with my mother's name dated just weeks after Mira's diagnosis. A new Mercedes paid for in full the same spring I maxed out my credit card to buy anti-nausea medication. There were letters too sweet and manipulative tucked in with the statements. Need extra this month, insurance is up. How's Mira? She would ask, her words soft and familiar. I had always answered with what I could spare. Looking at those notes now, I saw them for what they were, not requests, but expectations delivered with the confidence of someone who knows their hold on you will not be questioned. It's difficult to explain the hurt that comes from financial betrayal, especially when it is wrapped in the soft language of family. For years, I had believed that saying yes was my duty, that the strong one should give until there is nothing left. I never thought to say no. In those late-night moments, I remembered every time my mother had told me, "You're so independent, Elena. You don't need as much as your sister." It had always been easier to agree to hand over the last bit of savings to play the part of the responsible daughter who never asked for help in return. But staring at the evidence, I began to question everything. What had started as small favors and little loans had grown quietly into something much larger, a slow, invisible theft that ran parallel to my grief. In my mother's world, I was a bottomless well of support, a role I had accepted so often that I'd stopped noticing how empty I'd become. I thought back to those difficult months, the hospital visits, the mounting bills, the fear that crept in at night. I remembered counting coins to buy groceries, selling old jewelry, telling Mira we'd bake pancakes next week when things weren't so tight. All the while, money I desperately needed had already slipped away, replaced by nothing more than a series of polite thank yous and the unspoken promise that family always comes first. There is a kind of courage required to face this kind of truth. It's the courage to look directly at betrayal, not just the obvious wounds, but the small daily cuts you tried to ignore. I realized that my pain wasn't just about what was lost, but about what had been taken little by little by the people I had trusted most. Financial abuse within families is more common than we talk about. It hides behind birthday cards, friendly texts, and the assumption that it's just money after all. But the reality is harsher when those closest to you treat your resources as their own. It leaves a mark every bit as deep as any unkind word. The lesson for me was learning that boundaries are not a sign of selfishness. Saying no to a request, to an expectation, to a pattern you didn't create can be the first step in reclaiming your dignity. I knew sitting in that pool of evidence that I could not change the past, but I could stop the bleeding. I could say clearly and finally that my story would not be written by other people's needs. I took photos of every document and sent them to James, my lawyer, along with a note, "I'm ready to move forward." For the first time, the anger that stirred in my chest didn't feel destructive. It felt clarifying, like fresh air in a room too long closed. I allowed myself to imagine a future where what I earned, what I owned, and what I loved would belong to me, protected by my own vigilance. I thought of Mira and how fiercely she had guarded her treasures, her favorite rock collection, her best drawings, the last piece of glitter tape. She never let anyone take what was hers, no matter how small. And so, with a trembling sense of resolve, I prepared to confront my mother and sister, not with shouting or accusation, but with the calm certainty that comes from truth laid bare. What came next would not be easy. There would be anger, disbelief, and the old manipulations brought to the surface. But this time, I was ready to defend what was left: my home, my finances, my peace. Little did I know the confrontation ahead would be more dramatic and public than anything I could have imagined. Sometimes when you pull back the curtain on one injustice, others tumble out behind it. Old secrets, new betrayals, and the sudden blinding clarity of freedom. As I gathered my evidence and prepared for the next chapter, I felt the stirrings of something I had almost forgotten: hope, not for repair, but for real and lasting change. The day I decided to reclaim my grandmother's house, the air felt heavy with both dread and resolve. I woke before sunrise, heart-pounding thoughts cycling between fear and certainty. After months of moving through grief on autopilot, this was a different kind of bravery. There was nothing theatrical about it, no slammed doors or shouted accusations, just a quiet, persistent determination that this time the outcome would be different. I had my lawyer's words in writing the deed in hand and every piece of financial evidence lined up in a neat folder. It was time to stop shrinking and start drawing boundaries even if no one else liked the lines. That morning I drove to the house Mira had once called her castle. The neighborhood felt unchanged, ordinary in its routines. But as I pulled up, I saw a police cruiser parked discreetly down the street, just as James had arranged. Brielle's car was in the driveway, the same one Mom's transfers had paid for, and the windows glowed with morning light. I paused, looking up at the home that held so many memories, and allowed myself a moment to grieve what might have been. Then I knocked my hand steady, my heart steady enough. Brielle opened the door in a haze of confusion and irritation, her expression turning sharp when she saw the officers behind me. "What is this?" She snapped, arms crossed over her chest. I handed her the deed. "My name clear, legal, undeniable. You don't live here anymore," Brielle, I said quietly. The officers explained her rights, the 48-hour notice, and the legal documentation. The reality crashed in. First she pleaded, then threatened, then cried. Mom arrived mid-argument, her voice rising as she tried to rally sympathy. "Elena, you can't do this. Think of the family. You'll ruin everything." But this time, their words washed over me like rain on glass, no longer able to seep through. Neighbors emerged from their porches, quietly observing the spectacle they'd probably guessed was coming for months. The confrontation wasn't explosive. It was surgical. I didn't shout or list grievances. I stood firm and calm, the deed and the truth on my side. The hardest part wasn't Brielle's anger or Mom's disappointment. It was the cold realization that I was finally letting go, not just of the house, but of a lifetime of trying to earn love by giving everything away. For the first time, I understood what real boundaries felt like. Not cold, not cruel, but necessary. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can show yourself is to stop letting others decide your worth. After the officers delivered the formal notice, I changed the locks. My hands shook as I fitted each new key, but when the final click sounded, a quiet peace settled in my chest. That lock was more than a physical boundary. It was a promise to myself that I would no longer open the door to anyone who couldn't honor the life Mira and I had built. Alone in the living room, I looked around at the faded wallpaper and remembered Mira's laughter echoing down the hall. There was grief in that moment, but also relief of freedom born not of vengeance, but of choosing myself at last. Later that day, I walked room to room collecting the remnants Brielle had left behind. Scattered shoes, a pile of unopened mail, a half-drunk cup of coffee on the windowsill. Each item was a reminder of all the ways I had made space for other people while ignoring my own needs. I realized how many times I'd let inconvenience, guilt, and family obligation dictate the terms of my life. It's a common mistake, especially for those of us raised to believe that good daughters sacrifice everything. But as I boxed up the last of Brielle's belongings, I felt lighter than I had in years. That evening, as dusk crept in, I called James to confirm everything was in order. "You did the right thing, Elena," he said gently. Sometimes closure is a lock turning in the right direction. The phrase stayed with me, closure, not as an ending, but as a threshold to something better. I thought of Mira's favorite phrase when she finished a puzzle. "Now it fits, Mommy." For the first time, my life felt like it might finally fit too. Of course, nothing about this process was easy. There were calls from Mom pleading and angry, warning me about the damage I'd done to our family's reputation. There were texts from Brielle, ranging from threats to desperate apologies. But I didn't waver. I replied only with facts and left the rest unanswered. I'd learned at last that not every problem was mine to fix, and not every heartbreak needed my invitation to stay. What I didn't know was that standing my ground would provoke a new storm. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with an alert from the security system, a motion sensor triggered cameras shifting to night vision. Brielle was back, and this time, she didn't knock. She brought something that would turn a private struggle into a public scene, testing every bit of resolve I'd found. I watched breath held as the story that had been mine alone threatened to spill out for the world to see. The quiet after I changed the locks was not the peace I expected. It was tense like the pause before a summer storm, heavy with the knowledge that the worst was not yet over. I spent the next 2 days tidying the house, installing security cameras, and reacquainting myself with old comforts. Still, I couldn't quite relax. Each night, I double-checked the doors and windows, reminded of how quickly safety could turn into something that needed defending. I told myself this was just caution, not fear, but in truth, my instincts were sharper than ever, honed by too many years of giving others the benefit of the doubt. Late on the second night, my phone buzzed. The security app flashed, "Motion detected back door." My heart leapt into my throat. On the screen, night vision illuminated the driveway Brielle's car, half on the grass, headlights off. The camera caught her silhouette creeping toward the back of the house, a metal bat glinting in her hand. I watched in stunned disbelief as she raised it and swung, shattering the small window beside the kitchen door. Glass sprayed into the darkness, and for a moment, all the years of shared childhood seemed impossibly far away. I didn't hesitate. My hands moved on their own, dialing 911, voice steady as I explained, "My sister is breaking into my home. I have live footage. There's a restraining order in place." The dispatcher's calm was a small anchor. She assured me help was on the way. I stepped outside, phone clutched tightly, and waited by the curb, every muscle in my body tense. Within minutes, red and blue lights sliced through the night, washing the quiet street in urgency. Officer Ramirez, who had handled the eviction, recognized me immediately. His voice was gentle but businesslike. "She's inside," I nodded, pointing to the camera's feed. The next moments blurred. Police voices echoed down the driveway. Brielle burst through the front door, still clutching the bat, face wild with anger and desperation. "You called the cops on your own sister!" She spat, disbelief masking her panic. Officer Ramirez positioned himself between us, firm but calm. "Ma'am, drop the weapon." She did, finally, the bat clattering on the porch. The officers read her rights as she thrashed and cursed neighbors watching silently from shadowed windows. It struck me then that sometimes the most dramatic battles are not fought with words, but with choices. I stood my ground, and the ground did not give way. As the squad car pulled away, Brielle's voice faded into the night. I was left on my porch, shaken but not broken, replaying everything in my mind. I had called the police not out of spite but out of necessity. The truth is, when you set boundaries with someone who is used to breaking them, they will often test every lock, every rule, every ounce of your resolve. Their pain can become violent, their confusion explosive, but that's not your fault and it's not your burden to carry. This was a lesson I had learned the hardest way. You're allowed to protect yourself, even from those who share your blood. The following morning, I awoke to messages from my mother, angry, pleading, then accusing. She insisted I was destroying the family, that I should have handled things quietly. But violence isn't quiet. Hurt isn't quiet. And I was done pretending that protecting someone else's comfort was worth sacrificing my own peace. I answered her once simply, "You both made your choices. Now I am making mine." It was the most honest thing I'd said to her in years. What I didn't expect was the aftermath online. By noon, Brielle had posted a heavily edited video clips from the security footage, her own narration painting me as the villain. The story spread quickly in our small community, dividing people who only saw what they wanted. For a moment, I felt alone again, misunderstood, accused, vulnerable. But then something remarkable happened. Friends, neighbors, Mira's teachers and hospice nurse all began to comment, sharing what they had witnessed, the truth behind the empty front row seats at Mira's funeral, the support I'd shown through every storm. The real story, once hidden, found its own way to the light. It was messy, public, and painful, but it was also liberating. For years, I had been afraid of what people would think if they knew my family's reality. Now the truth was out in the open, and I realized that honesty can be its own kind of protection. There will always be people who don't understand, who prefer a neat story over a complicated one. But there will also be people who see you, who stand up for you, who remind you that your story matters, even the ugly, difficult chapters. That night, as the sun set over the battered house, I felt a new kind of stillness, one born not from fear, but from release. I knew that the journey wasn't over, that more battles and more reckonings lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I trusted myself to face whatever came next. And as the first stars blinked to life, I whispered a quiet promise to Mira, to myself, I will protect the home you loved and the woman you believed I could be. In the days after Brielle's midnight outburst, the world seemed to shrink and expand at once. The house felt strangely lighter with her gone, but outside its walls, the drama had spilled everywhere. It's a peculiar ache, realizing that a story so private, when built on years of hurt and silence, can become public property, with just a few clicks. Brielle's edited video, posted early the next morning, quickly gathered views and comments. In her version, I was cold and cruel, the heartless sister who had thrown her family into the street. The security footage was cut and rearranged, my voice clipped to sound sharp, her tears magnified her regret, staged for sympathy. Watching it, I felt the old sting of shame and confusion, the urge to explain myself to every stranger who saw it. But something happened I hadn't expected. Instead of quiet agreement or blind outrage, the comments section began to fill with new voices, familiar names, small but steady truths. Mira's teacher posted first. I was at the funeral. The family seats were empty. Next came her hospice nurse. I sat with Elena while she said goodbye. She did it alone. Her strength was more than most could bear. Neighbors added their memories, some kind and some blunt, all painting a fuller picture than Brielle's edits could contain. Little by little, the truth outgrew the lie. I learned in those days just how powerful community can be. The people who had witnessed my journey, the long hospital nights, the quiet grief, the small acts of kindness stood up in ways I hadn't known to hope for. They countered rumors with facts, offered sympathy without judgment, and reminded me that pain doesn't have to isolate. If you are honest and if you endure, the right people will find you in the noise. That was a lesson I carried like a shield, reading each message, not as vindication, but as proof that compassion survives even the hardest storms. Not everyone wanted the truth. There were still whispers at the grocery store, sideways glances at church. My mother, stung by the public fallout, called in a panic. Her voice, usually so measured, was frayed and desperate. The church is asking questions. Your aunt saw the video. This could destroy us. For the first time, I heard her fear and realized it wasn't for me or even for Brielle, but for her own reputation. She tried to twist the blame back onto me. You've always been difficult. You should have kept this quiet. Now people will never forget. I listened, but I didn't take her pain as my own. I had spent too many years doing that already. What surprised me most was how freeing the truth could be, even when it was messy, even when not everyone believed it. The pressure to pretend to shield my family from consequences finally lifted. I could see my choices clearly. I could keep fighting to be understood by those determined to misunderstand, or I could let their version of me belong to them and walk forward anyway. In that clarity, I found my footing again. I wasn't who Brielle painted me to be, nor was I the invisible daughter my mother accused of betrayal. I was simply a woman protecting her child's memory and her own future, refusing to let someone else define the story. During that turbulent week, James called to tell me the cease and desist letters were delivered. Brielle and my mother were legally barred from posting about me, at least for now. It felt like a small boundary restored, a line drawn in a world that had for so long refused to see mine. There was talk of restraining orders, more legal steps, and all the slow, difficult work of repair. But alongside that came a sense of peace, not because everyone approved of my choices, but because I no longer needed them to. One evening, I sat with a mug of tea on the front porch, watching the last light slip behind the trees. The house was quiet, but not empty. On the walls inside were Mira's drawings, each one a universe she'd imagined in crayon and hope. In their color, I found a reminder that beginnings can come from the most chaotic endings. My phone buzzed a new message from a friend of Mira's nurse, letting me know that people at the children's hospital were asking about me, wanting to send donations, wanting to help. It was a small thing, but it made me realize that the energy we put into the world, whether pain or hope, finds its own reflection. The week after the video, the mailbox began to fill with cards. Some were apologies from distant relatives, their words awkward but honest. I'm sorry, I believed the wrong story. Some were anonymous, just a daisy pressed in wax paper or a note that read, "You're not alone." I kept them all not as proof of victory, but as reminders that honesty is slow magic. It doesn't erase what's been done, but it changes what comes next. By then, the legal battles were just beginning. But the hardest part was over. I had learned that the real work of healing isn't proving yourself to people who refuse to listen. It's learning to live freely, even when the world is noisy with misunderstanding. That's a lesson I wish someone had told me years before, but maybe it's one you can only find for yourself. In the end, the truth was not the weapon I thought I needed, but the bridge I could finally cross. What I didn't realize, as I taped another daisy to the fridge and folded another thank you note into a box, was how close I was to a turning point. Not an ending, but a new direction. All the drama, the pain, the struggle for control, it was about to give way to something I'd never expected, the choice to build something meaningful from what remained. The next chapter would not be about defense, but about purpose. A purpose that would carry Mira's spirit far beyond the walls of this house, out into the world where it belonged. After the storm of legal filings and public fallout, a quiet clarity settled in the house. For the first time in what felt like years, I could hear my own heartbeat when I woke, instead of the pulse of anxiety or the echo of someone else's demands. With the legal boundaries set and the narrative reclaimed, I found myself facing a new question. What do you do when you finally have your life, your story, back in your own hands? The house was mine in every sense, but the weight of what it represented, loss, betrayal, and hope pressed on me as I walked its quiet rooms. It was more than property. It was a legacy, and for the first time I was free to choose what it meant. One evening, as the golden sunlight slanted across Mira's framed drawings, I sat on the living room floor and pulled out a box of her art supplies. There, in the tangle of crayons and stickers, I found the answer to a question I hadn't realized I was asking. This house was never meant to be a prize in a family feud nor a monument to pain. It was meant to be a haven, a launch pad for dreams just as Mira had always imagined, filling its walls with rocket stars and endless what-ifs. The idea took root gently, but firmly. Instead of selling the house or holding on to it out of pride, I could give it a new purpose, something that would make Mira's memory shine, rather than just linger. The next day, I called the local Children's Cancer Foundation, the same one that had offered us hope and kindness during Mira's hardest months. I asked what it would take to donate a house, to turn it into a retreat for families in crisis, a place where parents could rest, where children could draw on the walls if they wanted, where hope could grow quietly and without apology. Their stunned gratitude on the other end of the line was answer enough. Together, we began to plan a garden, a lending library of picture books art days in Mira's honor. Every detail was stitched with love, not for the family I'd lost, but for the community that had carried me when I needed it most. Some people questioned my decision. Aren't you angry, they asked? Don't you want to keep what's yours after everything you went through? But the truth was, I was tired of living as if every day were an act of defense. Giving away the house didn't feel like surrender. It felt like opening a window after a long winter. Mira taught me that joy is most real when it's shared. In letting go, I made room for something larger than vengeance or even justice, a kind of healing that echoes forward, offering rest and relief to people I would never meet. There were small miracles along the way. The foundation set up an art scholarship in Mira's name. Local artists volunteered to paint murals, children sent in drawings from across the city. In the kitchen, the one with the pink tiles Mira loved, volunteers installed a corkboard already crowded with thank you notes, recipes, and sketches. Walking through the house, I felt Mira's spirit in every corner, not as a shadow, but as sunlight, bright, impossible to hold, and endlessly renewing. My pain was still there, but it was joined by something gentler pride, not in what I had survived, but in what I had chosen to build. The lesson for me was simple but hard won. You can let go without losing yourself. You can transform loss into legacy even when no one else believes it's possible. My story, Mira's story, had started in the rubble of what was broken, but it grew roots in the hope of what could still be made new. Purpose doesn't always come from victory. Sometimes it comes from the quiet work of rebuilding in the aftermath of defeat. As I handed over the keys to the foundation director, a woman whose own daughter had once fought cancer in the same hospital as Mira, I felt a lightness I hadn't known since before the funeral. The finality of that gesture was not about closing a door, but opening 100 more. On my way out, I took a last look at Mira's bedroom, where rockets and stars danced along the wall, and whispered a promise. You'll always belong here, not just in memory, but in hope. But this isn't where my story ends. The work of healing is never finished, not really. As I turned from the house and stepped into the wide, uncertain light of a new day, I felt ready finally to begin again to nurture a future that belonged wholly to me and to whatever new dreams I dared to claim. The next chapter wasn't about houses or legal victories, but about something deeper, reclaiming the power to live and to love on my own terms. The first morning in my new chapter arrived not with fanfare, but with the soft certainty of routine. The house was no longer mine, but the world beyond it felt at last open and kind. I brewed coffee in a quiet kitchen, sunlight warming my face, and for the first time in months, I felt no weight on my chest, only breath, slow and sure. The walls around me were different, the view from my window unfamiliar, but I carried with me something that no one could take: the memory of Mira's laughter and the knowledge that I had found my own courage in the face of heartbreak. I had expected that letting go would feel like an ending, but life kept whispering that there was more ahead. On Tuesdays, I began volunteering at the community center, helping to run art days for children. some of them fighting illnesses, some just hungry for color and hope. Each week, we filled long tables with paper paint and glitter. The laughter that bubbled up from those sessions was its own kind of music. I watched children discover their own small superpowers just as Mira had once done, and I realized that healing is not a moment, but a practice, an act you repeat gently, again and again, until the ache quiets and you see the world as new. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low, I visited Mira's grave bringing daisies or her favorite stickers. I'd kneel in the fresh grass, tracing her name on the cool stone, and tell her all about the kids she was helping, the art she had inspired, the little victories that had grown from her memory. One day, I found a folded note on her headstone, a crayon drawing from a neighbor's child who had heard about Mira's house. It was a picture of stick figures holding hands beneath a giant smiling sun. "Thank you for making a place where we can be happy," it read in looping, earnest handwriting. I kept that note in my wallet, a quiet reminder that kindness ripples far beyond its first splash. With time, the bitterness of the past faded, not forgotten, but softened like old bruises turning gold at the edges. My mother and Brielle drifted to the outskirts of my life. There were more attempts to reconnect, apologies filtered through guilt or self-pity, but I didn't reach back. I wished them peace, but I no longer measured my worth by their affection. The family I built through friends, children at the center, nurses, and neighbors grew larger and sturdier than I ever thought possible. I learned that you can choose who stands in your front row, and you can fill empty seats with people who truly show up. If there is a lesson to share, it is this: pain will visit, but it does not have to stay. Betrayal will shape you, but it does not get to finish your story. You are allowed to step out of old roles, to write new chapters, to claim a future that is wider and brighter than what was lost. What began as a journey through heartbreak and injustice became for me a quiet revolution, a gentle, persistent choosing of myself, and the love that survived everything. On the anniversary of Mira's passing, I sat on my porch as the stars blinked awake. I thought of all the ways love endures in laughter and art, in the patient daily act of beginning again. I whispered my thanks to her, to the house that held us, to every stranger who chose kindness. The peace that settled around me wasn't loud or triumphant. It was a soft, unbreakable knowing I had survived, I had rebuilt, and in the simple act of telling my story, I had found my way home. And for anyone listening, anyone standing at the edge of their own ending, I hope you'll remember this: sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from winning, but from letting go, from daring to believe in new beginnings, and from trusting that even in the darkest night, your light is never truly lost. If this story touched something in you, I hope you'll remember you're not alone, even in the quietest moments of your own struggle. If you're walking through grief, heartbreak, or the hard work of rebuilding, I invite you to share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the smallest words of encouragement can make all the difference for someone else. If you found comfort here, consider subscribing or sharing this video with a friend who might need it too. Your voice, your kindness, your presence. These are gifts that ripple farther than you know. And if you want to support organizations that help families like mine, I'll include some links in the description. Thank you for listening, for believing in second chances, and for being part of this community. No matter where you are on your journey, may you find the courage to let go, the strength to begin again, and the hope to create new meaning from whatever you've lost. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and never underestimate the power of your own story.